This servant of God, remarkable especially for her great charity toward the poor, was born in Rome, in 1474, of the noble family of the Albertoni. Her parents, distinguished no less by their virtuous life than by their high social standing, devoted the greatest care to the Christian education of their daughter, and strove to instill into her innocent heart a great love for piety and virtue. They knew that wealth and noble birth avail nothing in the eyes of God unless they are joined to a good life. They also knew that, to avoid the many spiritual dangers arising from the riches and honors of the world, their child must be imbued with a truly Christian spirit from her childhood. Hence, they endeavored, by word and example, to show her the beauty and happiness of the service of God and carefully guarded her against the least contagion of sin. They had the happiness of seeing their efforts bear abundant fruit. Louise strove with the greatest docility to carry out the instructions and counsels of her good parents. Drawn by the love of God, she turned away from the vanities and pleasures of the world, and found her delight in exercises of piety and in the practice of self-denial, so that she was soon looked upon as a model for all maidens of her age. In her desire to belong to God alone, Louise resolved to consecrate her virginity to him. But when her parents urged her to marry James de Cythera, a rich nobleman of great piety, she, after serious deliberation and many prayers, saw in the wish of her parents the will of God, and gave her consent. In her new state of life, the servant of God continued in all things to do the will of the Heavenly Father and to grow in virtue. By her holy example, she exercised a most wholesome influence on her household. Her husband, full of admiration for her virtues, took care not to interfere in any way with her works of piety and charity. God blessed the union of James and our saint with 3 daughters, whose education absorbed much of the attention of the pious mother. She strove, as we read in a sketch of her life, to form them according to the law of God, to preserve them from the poisonous breath of the world, to inculcate in them a taste for piety and a love for virtue. Knowing how important it is to nourish the mind with the solid truths of religion, she read aloud to them every day some pious book, and herself presided over the prayers they said in common. The time that other women pass in adorning themselves, or in paying useless visits, she spent with her children training them for all the duties of their position and especially their duties toward God. Like the saintly Blanche of Castile, she repeatedly said to them that, in spite of the love she bore them, or rather on account of that love, she would sooner weep at their graves than know they had been guilty of a single mortal sin. The happy life which the servant of God was spending with her pious husband was, however, not to last long. Her husband fell seriously ill, and soon passed to his heavenly reward. It was a severe blow for the loving wife, but in the midst of her tears, she adored the will of God and prepared to follow the inspirations of grace. She resolved to give herself entirely to God and to consecrate her life henceforward to prayer, penance, and works of mercy. In order to break entirely with the world, Louise entered the Third Order of St. Francis, and prepared to lead a life according to the spirit of the Seraphic Father. And how perfectly did she not carry out her resolve? Let us again quote from the sketch of her life. In the privacy of her home, seen only by the eye of God, she chastised her flesh in order to subject it to the spirit, fasting rigorously, and sleeping on the bare ground. When people tried to make her moderate her austerities, she would answer, "How can we live without suffering, when we see our God hang on the cross?" The scenes of the Passion possessed an irresistible attraction for her heart. She spent long hours in the contemplation of the sufferings of the man God, and the tears which she shed were so plentiful that she nearly lost her sight in consequence. Part of the night was devoted to prayer. In the morning she heard Mass and received Holy Eucharist, after which she attended to her household. Louise confined her own personal needs within very narrow limits, and her pious savings allowed her to help the poor to a great extent. Looking upon herself as their mother, their sufferings became her sufferings, their privations her privations, their tears the source of her sorrows. She visited them in their wretched dwellings, bearing with her plentiful alms and words of comfort. Her chief care was always the welfare of their souls, and she was not sparing of good advice nor, when the occasion required, of stern warnings. Young girls in a destitute condition were the special objects of her solicitude. She gave them work, instructed them, protected them against the dangers of the world, and sometimes supplied them with a dowry in order that they might make a respectable marriage, or consecrate themselves in a religious house. Louise strove to conceal her extraordinary liberality from the sight of men as much as possible, and with this intent she hid pieces of gold and silver in the bread she gave away, praying meantime that the largest alms might fall to the share of those who most needed it. The humility which had struck such deep roots in her heart caused her to shun the praise which her holy life and her charity might have drawn upon her, whilst, on the other hand, contempt and humiliations were her delight, and her heart would leap with inexpressible joy when the Roman ladies reproached her with leading a life more fitting a daughter of the people than the heiress of a great name. In a year of famine which laid waste all Italy and especially the city Rome, Louise, deeply moved at the sight of the great distress around her, sold her possessions and gave the proceeds to the needy, thus reducing herself to extreme poverty. God rewarded the generosity of his servant by lavishing upon her many heavenly consolations. Ecstasies, raptures, visions, and other supernatural favors were frequently granted to her during the last years of her life. After Louise had thus spent about 27 years in prayer, penance, and works of charity, God made known to her that the hour of death was at hand. This revelation filled her with great spiritual joy, for her heart had long been detached from the things of the world and she desired to be with God. She prepared with the greatest fervor for her passage into eternity, and after receiving the last sacraments with sentiments of love and confidence she calmly fell asleep in the Lord, on January 31, 1533. Her death caused great mourning in Rome, especially among the poor. The whole College of Cardinals assisted at her obsequies, which took place in the midst of an immense concourse of people. A cardinal preached the funeral sermon. Her body was entombed in the church of San Francesco a Ripa, in charge of the friars minor. Many miracles were wrought at her tomb, wherefore Clement X, in 1671, sanctioned the veneration paid to her.